Hello, everybody. Good afternoon here in London. I'm delighted to introduce you to this session, which, as Sherilyn said, is all about innovative storytelling and from lots of different perspectives. So we've got a great panel from all around the world this afternoon. I'll introduce them as we come one by one. And to start with, we're going to hear from Shirish Kulkarni, and contrary to what you just saw on the screen there, he is a UK-based journalist. He's worked across the media in BBC, Sky, and so on. But now he works for a very interesting outfit, which has been going for a while here in the UK, called the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is a really sort of cutting-edge investigative outlet. And they have a particular area which is focused on local news called the Bureau Local, and that's where Shirish is. So I actually spoke to him a bit earlier. So we're going to hear, first of all, a panelist from Shirish Kulkarni, who is going to talk about different ways that he's sort of thought through over this past pandemic period about telling stories and the kind of obligations and the way that journalists should think about relating to their audiences. So let's hear, first of all, from Shirish.
So thanks, Suzanne. Thanks very much for inviting me today, and it's a real honour to be asked to speak alongside such distinguished company on such an important topic. So I'm going to be talking today about the importance of storytelling, because what we've learned about the way journalism has worked, or in many cases not worked, during this pandemic, and how we can learn the lessons for future health crises. So, just to quickly introduce myself, I've been a journalist for over 25 years, working in all the UK's major TV newsrooms, and more recently as a freelance investigative journalist. For the last year or so, I've been researching storytelling in news and asking really fundamental questions about the nature of journalism and society, some of the insights from which I'll be talking about today. I've been combining that with working also as a community organiser at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism here in the UK, which has also taught me a lot about how we can better engage with our communities and address some of the fundamental issues of trust and inclusion that frankly blight our industry right now. And central to that is remembering that journalism is for citizens. It's not for journalists, it's not for us. And we need to think about citizens at every point of what we do. And that, of course, is even more true in a pandemic. So I think that what we need to remember in that is that in a health crisis, journalism is an emergency service. Now, you may think that we can't compare ourselves with real emergency workers, doctors, nurses, and paramedics, and of course that's right. But it's also true to say that if citizens don't get or don't trust balanced, accurate, and comprehensible information from journalists, then many more people will lose their lives than would otherwise be the case. Pandemics, as we've seen, aren't just a medical crisis, they're an information crisis. And as journalists, we're in the front line of that crisis and have to be prepared to act with the responsibility that that implies. What that means, I think, is a really good thing, a reconnection with why many of us became journalists, to make a difference and help people. I was incredibly frustrated at the beginning of this year as I saw media organisations across the world taking turns to, somewhat complacently, I think, boast about their audience figures. Now, news isn't an entertainment show. To get back to my framing of journalism as an emergency service, every click, every extra viewer, every extra page view, those were emergency calls. All those readers and viewers were looking for, asking for help. And instead we treat those clicks or those views as an endorsement. What's happened since then is, I think, a really important lesson. A recent report by the Reuters Institute found that here in the UK, for example, Not only has engagement with the media fallen dramatically since the beginning of the pandemic, but we've also lost even more of the trust of our citizens. And that has got to be an enormous failure on the part of our industry. So how can we do better? How can we provide better journalism that connects with and engages citizens and re-inspires trust? Well, this is what I've been looking at in my storytelling research by speaking to storytellers of all kinds, not just journalists, and of course working directly with citizens. And from that work, I synthesized 7 key building blocks for better journalism that I'm going to share with you here. So first, the content. At a basic level, is the content we're providing really giving a full and informative picture to our readers and viewers, or genuinely contributing to their understanding of the world? I think because of the formats and the habits we habitually inhabit, often we fail dismally on this very basic question. So central to this, frankly, is whose views we foreground. We instinctively, habitually reach for political reaction to stories. But this pandemic is actually far better explained by scientists than by politicians. Interestingly, another recent Reuters Institute report found that citizens view domestic politicians as the greatest source of disinformation in the media. If we don't actually need them for every story, why are we using them? Let's reconsider our habits and instead reach more for trusted sources: doctors, nurses, clinicians, scientists. Next, what my research really brought home to me was how much audiences are crying out for context, and how journalism's inability to deal with long-term systemic questions is failing us all. On-the-day news hugely prioritizes breaking, or at least somehow moving events, but largely to the detriment of context, analysis, and importantly, understanding. On one level, this makes news largely incomprehensible to many people, because news organizations are so focused on the habit of constantly updating the top line or finding an angle, that the underlying point or issue quickly becomes really difficult to unpick for us as viewers or readers if you're not watching the news every hour or reading the news every day. On that issue, I want to add one more really important point here about the ludicrous siloing of journalism specializations. Our internal newsroom politics, because that's all it is, means that health correspondents, business correspondents, and economics correspondents are all off doing their entirely separate stories, which largely end up playing off against each other. And that's one of the reasons that's why we've ended up with a false dichotomy, which has somehow pitted the economy against deaths. And that's just not a sensible way to do journalism. Coronavirus is altogether a health, business, and economy issue. And we need to look at the problem much more holistically, instead of creating artificial boundaries just because, frankly, they suit the egos of journalists. There are much bigger things going on in the world, and we need to be much more tuned in to that. Next, we have agency. So when I talk about agency, I mean both on the input side and the output side. We need to offer in our coverage a way for people to feel like they're genuinely involved in the world and can make a difference. News isn't just happening to us as passive victims of the news. We're all citizens of our communities and have our own power. Now, clearly, vox pops are the worst example of this, but can't we do better at also giving citizens agency in our storytelling and letting them also be authors of solutions, not just victims of problems? Also, on the output side, is there a way we can express our agency, our curiosity, our choices as to how we read or watch journalism? Curiosity is something at an evolutionary level that we're hardwired for. So shouldn't we be working with that too? The voice we use to communicate, tone, is horribly old-fashioned and formulaic. Last year's Reuters Digital News Report looked at this and found that only 16% of people thought that the news media uses the right tone. All I have to say on this is that I ran a workshop with a group of young people of colour here in the UK, and we watched a BBC News bulletin with them. It was frankly enormously embarrassing, but it's something that journalists should do a lot more of. Sitting there with 20 young people and seeing how quickly they were turned off by the content and tone was quite something. So we need to find a different way of talking with people. Much of our language is just habits we've transferred from newspapers of 50 years ago, either to the newspapers of now, which are a different medium in themselves, or to television, which is an entirely different medium. It makes no sense. Diversity. Now, this is something I'm passionate about because it's just so important. Innovation in storytelling isn't just about telling stories differently. It's not about different formats. It's about telling different stories. You don't get that if you don't listen to different perspectives and really hear them and reflect them. And that goes for gender, race, disability, sexuality, everything. I saw some horrifying research in this last week which suggested that journalists tended to trust research less if it was written by someone with a foreign name. Now that is absolutely horrifying, but there are so many similar examples. For example, it's also clear that the work and views of male scientists are traditionally considered more important than that of women. And that has become a habit in journalism too. And that has to change if we're to get the diversity of opinions we need to re-inspire trust. Transparency, this is a really big one. And it speaks again to that existential problem of trust. We have to be transparent and we need to be clear about what we're reporting, how we're getting the information, and also acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge where they exist. And those gaps are enormous. Sometimes we have to say, we don't know, rather than saying something we don't know. If we don't, then people will fill in the gaps, see conspiracy where there isn't, and that's how we kind of get to the mess we're all in right now. So, the more eagle-eyed among you will notice that's only 6 building blocks, and I promised 7. And that 7th is the overarching principle of narrative and the way we tell our stories. The way I come at this is from fundamental principles of anthropology and neuroscience. We are deeply, fundamentally, and universally hardwired for stories. Across cultures, they're used as kind of virtual reality simulators for life. They teach us how to navigate the world, prepare us for difficulties, and ultimately teach us about how we might live more fulfilling lives. Now, I'm still at nearly 50, a naive idealist, but isn't that, at some level, what journalism should be about too, and particularly in times of health crisis? So Jonathan Gottschall, in his brilliant book, The Storytelling Animal, which I really recommend, puts it beautifully, I think, when he says, "We are as a species addicted to story. Even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories. But our dreams aren't written in inverted pyramid style. So why are our news stories?" The rather prosaic reason for that is the Telegraph, the original newswire, because it was expensive and unreliable, so it made sense to put as much information as possible at the beginning, just in case you lost the end of it. Now, we don't use the Telegraph anymore, that's gone. But the habits formed by that technology still bizarrely define journalism. Given that our communications technology has completely transformed several times since the Telegraph, it's ludicrous that journalism hasn't. So as part of my research, I had the pleasure of talking to Jonathan on a couple of occasions, and what those conversations really reinforced for me was that if we want our news stories to connect and engage our audiences, we have to engage that natural yearning for stories that's just a fundamental part of us. What that largely means is writing in a linear rather than inverted style. And kind of on that theme, the truth is that with complex stories, where it's crucial that citizens understand the full context and have the opportunity to take in all the relevant information, the inverted pyramid just isn't fit for purpose. It's just not the way we're programmed to understand stories. We actually need to draw readers and viewers through the narrative, starting at the beginning and ending at the end. The problem with headlines, or even a top paragraph which summarize information, is they can never give the full story or context. And that is just not good enough when these are literally matters of life and death. We should be removing any barriers to understanding when we write, not deliberately adding them by writing in a contrived format that actually does little to encourage deep engagement and actually encourages skimming or just skipping everything apart from the headline or the top paragraph. Similarly, we have to start to become more focused on providing clear and comprehensible information rather than always looking for the angle. As an example, I've been really frustrated here in the UK by how much journalism is focused in trying to somehow find loopholes or the very edges of the restrictions we've had. It's driven the discourse to be around what we can do and what we can't do, rather than what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And that's just not healthy, either philosophically or practically in real life. I was really struck in that regard by how a journalist for a major UK broadcaster here actually spent a lot of time discovering that, in principle, it would be possible to travel from Belgium to Wales, where I live, when it wasn't possible to travel from England to Wales. Apart from the fact they largely ignored the fact they'd have to self-isolate for 14 days anyway, it was very telling to me that it received an entirely critical response from members of the public. They weren't interested in the journalistic angle. What they wanted was clear public health information and saw that enterprise largely as an irresponsible waste of time. And it's really difficult to disagree with that. So we need to do better at things like that. So to sum all that up, I came up with an overall aim that journalism in general, but in health crises in particular, should be about orientation. By that I mean that consuming news should help us understand the world, locate us in our environment, and help us understand and meaningfully interact with it. Ultimately, it should help us form a view which is consistent with our own personal and community interests and needs. Now that sounds really obvious, but when you look at the journalism which actually exists in the world, and I encourage you to do that, very little actually achieves those aims. And that is really worrying. So my overarching message here is that journalism is a service in the public interest. We need to remember that we're here to meet the needs of citizens, and thinking about how best to do that should be at the heart of everything that we do. We need to provide clear, engaging and useful journalism that helps citizens orientate themselves in the world and make rational, informed decisions. In many ways, we failed in our responsibilities during this pandemic, but the conversations I've had here and elsewhere around this subject give me real hope that we're learning, that we want to change, and that we can and will do better in the future. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a real privilege to speak to you all today.
Thank you very much indeed, Shirish. That was a fascinating tour de force, and really has given us a lot to think about in terms of the way that journalism is done and maybe done. So just a few questions for you before we move on. You were very critical of the fact that a lot of journalism isn't getting it right and is failing to sort of deliver the kind of the real information that people want and the stories that people want. So have you got any examples for us of outlets that are actually getting it right and serving them?
I mean, I think at the root of that is that in a way we're ill prepared for this kind of thing, for what is a health emergency. And actually, I think we're still in that mode that we're competing with other outlets, and that's where that stuff around the angle comes. We've got to have an exclusive here or scoop. So finding those kind of loopholes feels like what we do, when actually this is a public health emergency. I'm not saying we should be mouthpieces for the government, far from it, because governments are getting this wrong. But actually what we should be looking for is clear public health information that's really going to help citizens understand the world. And I think a really good example here is what the Financial Times here in the UK has been doing with its data journalism, because it's wholly fact-based. And I think fact-based stuff is really important. And again, it sounds obvious, but too often we're reaching political opinions or just opinions, frankly. And actually what we really need is fact-based journalism. And so what they've done with their data journalism, the really great visualizations that they've done, is helping presenting complex information in a really accessible and comprehensible way. And I think we need more of that generally in journalism. Well, in journalism generally, but particularly in a health crisis.
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because of course John Burn-Murdoch is also in this session as well. So you've set up his work very well for later on. Okay, so you've talked a lot about the need for science to have a sort of more prominent role in the newsroom, and that has been a sort of ongoing issue. And in fact, science is the number of specialist science correspondents has declined in many cases. How do you think we can sort of reconfigure that we get this more specialist input into general news, and that science can sort of assert itself, really, if you like, within storytelling and within news?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that comes down to the culture of newsrooms and what I talked about in that kind of siloing of specialisms. So I see this particularly with health, but actually, I suppose particularly with, for instance, the environment correspondent is always placed kind of on the edge of the newsroom as somehow separate from the economy. And that's happened, as I say, with health as well. It's like somehow separate from the economy. So we're playing those things off against each other. And actually, in a way, that is a newsroom culture thing. We need to remember or kind of, yeah, in a way, teach ourselves that science is at the heart of almost everything we do, from climate change to health to everything, really, and not treat those as kind of, you know, specialisms on the edge of the newsroom where they're kind of, you know, surrounded by a tower of books and that kind of, you know, that kind of cliche, really, which just isn't true and isn't helpful to us. We need to kind of make our journalism fit for the 21st century and not still be clinging to the kind of the habits of kind of what we in the UK would say, you know, old Fleet Street newsrooms with cigarette smoke kind of, you know, sleeping above the piles of papers from the 1950s. And actually so much of our journalism is mired in those cultures still, and we need to really change that.
Yes, no, I think that's a very interesting point, because I think certainly a lot of the press conferences in the UK were all the time fronted by political journalists who really didn't know what the questions to ask the politicians were, and if they'd, because of this sort of, I suppose it's a kind of power struggle in a way that you were talking about in the newsroom, that if we could put science higher in the agenda, we'd do a lot better. So you've given us a very, very compelling, but some would say a slightly high-minded view of what journalism can be doing at the moment. And there's wonderful examples of long-form journalism which really explores and interrogates and gives us sort of wider context. But isn't that quite difficult in a culture which is sort of all the time going for smaller and smaller sound bites? If it can't be said in 240 characters, it isn't worth saying. So how do you kind of manage that balance?
Yeah, so I am not at all advocating necessarily, or really at all in a way, for the kind of 5,000 word long reads And actually, because what I'm really concerned about is actually, particularly in a health crisis, that we reach a mass market. And actually, the sort of second phase of my research after the sort of philosophical stuff was creating real world prototypes, which actually put some of those principles into action. And what I found was that by creating kind of bite-sized modules of information, which could be read in any order or in, you know, how you wanted to read them, or, you know, the subjects you wanted to read first, to create choice, that agency. The prototypes I created were half as long as the standard BBC news article, but actually achieved 33% more information transfer. People felt they knew 33% more on average than what they had done from reading a twice as long article on the BBC News. So I think it can be done. So yeah, people can kind of look up the work I've done kind of on my Medium or Twitter or whatever, but actually the prototypes are really interesting exercise. It's very good to have high-minded thoughts and to have big ideas, to have a long conversation, but actually we're in the real world and we can only make a difference in the real world if we kind of apply ourselves to those real world problems. I think we did, and there's real hope for the future in that to reach those mass markets.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Shirish. That's given us a lot to chew on now, and it's a very interesting way of leading into our next session. Thank you.
So thanks very much to Shirish, who we recorded a bit earlier, and he's really given us a very good entry into our next speaker, who he mentioned. So we're now going to hear from John Burn-Murdoch, who is the data visualization specialist at the Financial Times. I'm delighted to welcome John. He's actually also a graduate of City University journalism, where I'm based. So he's done very well. He's kind of really made a name for himself now in telling these data stories, and has done a brilliant job over the past months in telling the story of the coronavirus catastrophe as it sort of both in the UK and across the world. So I'm going to hand over now to John, who's going to talk for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have some questions.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. And it's, again, a real privilege to be here and speaking to you all today. I should also just echo the comments there on Shirish's talk, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. I think that's one of the best and sort of most comprehensive critiques of the state of journalism at the moment that I've heard. And I was worried at an early stage that the FT was going to be one of those that he was sort of pointing his finger at. But it was great to hear that we may have come out on the right side of that stuff. But it did lead me to actually rethink about how I sort of frame some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about just now. So I think good mark of an excellent talk is when you actually get your sort of co-presenters scrabbling around to change what they're saying, but no, luckily no substantive changes. So yeah, I'm just going to share my screen, and so you can see what I'm going to be talking to you about today, which is how here at the FT we've sort of reacted as this pandemic has gone along, and really learned a lot on our feet, really, in terms of what works and what doesn't work, and to Shirish's point, what people actually want from the news media during a global health crisis. So I'm John Burn-Murdoch. I'm a senior data visualization journalist at the FT. But for a while back in the spring, I was probably easier to track down online by searching death charts guy, which was quite a strange position to find myself in. But again, I think just shows that the work we were doing really was cutting through, and people were identifying me and our team at the FT as fundamentally as a resource. We were a source of information that they wanted to use. And so I'm going to talk about the importance of data journalism in covering this pandemic, and just in the industry right now as a whole, and how it's not just been an important piece of work in the context of the pandemic, but it's really And this was one of the points I think Shirish made that I want to make sure I'm not being too sort of self-congratulatory about now, because he talked about how newsrooms were bragging about the traffic they were getting in 2020. But I do want to talk about that perhaps in a slightly more nuanced and constructive way, about how delivering good quality data journalism, visual journalism, objective work really can drive traffic in a way that I'm not patting ourselves at the FT on the back here, but I'm saying it does demonstrate that what we're doing really was providing value to people. So this chart and the various iterations that it has shaped itself into over the last few months is I think the sort of flagship product that we've been putting out over the last few months, which is showing how the virus was spreading over time in different parts of the world, and therefore whether different countries could be heading for the same future as countries like Italy back in the spring that people were already aware were facing very bad outbreaks, or whether indeed countries could follow the paths of successful countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, and latterly South Korea, and sort of get off that curve. And I think it really speaks to the point Shirish was making there, that what we were doing here was listening to the conversations on social media and in our own comments and on the news about what was it that people seemed to want to find out about this pandemic. And that was quite simply whether their country, their region, their town was headed for a similar fate as other parts of the world. And that really is what we focused on with this chart, and indeed have done with the dozens or even hundreds of other charts that we've produced over the last few months, just thinking about what is the information that someone actually wants to get out of this, and presenting that information with minimal additional sort of dressing up or narrative construction. And what you're looking at here is a sort of anonymized or desensitized version of the traffic to the Financial Times page that hosted these charts. So this was our global coronavirus tracker that we published, as you can see there, at the start of February, when the virus was still mainly confined to China and other parts of Asia. And what you see is around the 11th of March there was when we first started putting this particular chart into that page. And you see how the number of people coming to this page skyrocketed at that point. And I think that really speaks chapters for exactly that point I was just making, which was that up until this point, this page had contained essentially our idea of what we felt as journalists editorially were the most interesting bits of this story to be putting out there. But what changed when we started putting charts like this in was we were really listening to what questions people had and how we could answer those in the form of data and charts. And that's when traffic rocketed. That's when we had people clamoring for us to take down the paywall, which we did very quickly, and really showed, I think, that we were delivering on that promise of providing people with the information that they need. We also found, in terms of what our readers got from this, that so visual journalism increases engagement. What I mean by that is the amount of time that people would spend with the piece of journalism, and the percentage of that story they would actually scroll through and really sort of get their teeth into, has been consistently higher on any of our pages, including data and visual journalism, over this year. And the conversion rate as well for an organization like the FT that's funded by subscriptions is very important. We've seen that people are more likely to go from being sort of visitors to the site to actual subscribers when they've encountered this sort of data-rich and visually rich journalism. So I think this is really showing that, partly through the point Shirish made about this being as objective as you can get, just putting the data out there, but also the fact that we're using charts to allow to really sort of open the curtains and allow people to dig into the data themselves. I think these all seem to be things that people really appreciate during a global health crisis, but just in general, in terms of what media organizations can do, and they've really gained a lot of value from that. We've had feedback like this. This is one email and one tweet from people saying they've actually subscribed to the FT as a direct result of the work we've been doing with data and visualizations, which has been obviously very rewarding for us. So I'm going to talk very quickly now about a few things that we do at the FT to really put the reader at the front and center of what we're doing when we produce these charts and other data visualizations. Because again, I think some people in the sort of visual journalism field have a tendency to, because the act of putting together data visualizations is essentially a technical skill. I think some people naturally therefore put their focus on how to make the most intricate or elegant or complex visualization they can, when usually that may have some cachet within the sort of data visualization community, but what you really should be focusing on is simplicity and clarity in the work that you do. And that's really something we take very, very seriously at the FT, including following the best scientific evidence, to go a bit meta, on how you actually do that. So I'm going to show you very quickly now a piece of work from a scientific study which actually asked, when people look at a chart or data visualization, what are they focusing on and what do they take away from it? And so the researchers here used eye tracking software to see where people's attention was when a chart was put in front of them. And what you see here is a little blue dot, which is going to show where people look when they see a chart. And the researchers here, they did this with hundreds of charts and hundreds of participants. And you'll see this loop play again in a second. And that blue dot of focus, you'll see, goes straight up to the title, top 10 most read books in the world in this case. Then it comes down to the actual chart itself, but spends probably a similar amount of time just reading the words on the chart as it does looking at the content of the chart itself. And the researchers also found that when they asked people after the fact to describe the charts and maps that they'd seen, the participants were far more likely to mention things like the title or paragraphs and labels of text when they were recalling the imagery, the visualizations they've seen. So the point being, use of text in data visualizations is absolutely critical in terms of cutting through to a mass audience. And so that's something we pay a huge amount of attention to at the FT. And no better example than our charts, our headline coronavirus chart itself. Now, what you're looking at here is essentially a stripped back version of that chart, showing the same information, the number of days since a country's outbreak began along the bottom, and then the number of cases climbing up as time went by vertically. But this is obviously quite Spartan. This is very plain. It's difficult to know what's actually going on here. If I hadn't been here to explain what this chart shows, I don't think you would have got it. But when we add text to that, we set the scene. We've got the title giving you the key message, which is that most Western countries were indeed on the same trajectory, whereas several successful Asian countries have managed to get off that curve. We've got these little annotations talking about what was actually happening in each of those countries that had succeeded, and various things like that. And it completely transforms this sort of very dry, scientific, sterile display into something much more narrative, much more engaging, and something that people feel is actually telling them something. With this one, I'm asking someone to work out what's going on. With this one, we're telling people, we're giving people the information, we're giving people the answer to their question. So we've really thought long and hard about text. It also means that even for a chart like this, where we were updating this day by day for months, you can't just leave those bits of text the same, because when the story changes, you need to reframe things. And so as we got further on, for example, we're talking here about how Italy at this stage had turned the corner and its numbers of cases were now falling. So paying attention to use of text in graphics, we find is something very, very important in making sure that, let's say, quote unquote, non-charts people or non-numbers people still have an entry point into this work, and they don't feel like we're sort of trying to get too clever for them. Another thing which is obviously critical is responding to user feedback, even in cases where with our sort of technical data hats on, we might think that these people are incorrect. So a lot of the reactions we got to these charts were from people who were confused with some of the scales and axes we'd used on these charts, and felt that in some ways they were downplaying the severity of the virus, even though we were doing these because we felt they were actually making the story clearer. But what we did was we went away and we thought, okay, we had our own rationale for doing this, but it seems to be causing confusion for some people. And so we came up with this interactive version of the chart shortly afterwards, which then allowed people to choose their own settings, how they want to display the information, which I think, number one, serves that purpose of reducing the confusion or the potential of being misleading for those people who had been struggling with this. But it also, again, I think emphasizes that we're at the service of our reader. We are allowing people here to choose to display the information in whatever way works best for them, really making them come to see us again as a resource and as something for them, not something for for us and for making ourselves feel good about ourselves. We also actually set up a completely separate email inbox because we were getting so many responses to this one particular chart. So this was just one snapshot from early April, when a whole page of emails just from one day, the 12th of April here. And there's a huge amount of stuff here. You've got people pointing out things they think we've got wrong. You've got people just saying this is great work. You've got people asking for whether we could include something else, or people even offering data that they themselves have found. So we found this to be hugely helpful as well, because it gave us a constant sort of real-time feed of how people felt about our work, whether they were struggling with it, whether they wanted new things. And that was a hugely useful exercise, I think, for us. And also people were obviously very grateful when we did respond and take on board their suggestions. Another thing we try to do, I'm sure most people on the call today will have become aware that this pandemic has become extremely polarizing and politicized. So there are now some people who have come to sort of form a whole way of thinking about COVID, whether perhaps everything's terrible and we need to be taking as much action as we possibly can, and then in other camps it's all being exaggerated and lockdowns aren't needed and that kind of thing. So in order, again, at the FT, for us not to be labeled as sort of taking a partisan stance on this, one thing we try to do is we include caveats and messaging in our charts, which means that whatever one's viewpoint is of the situation, they will still be able to take something away from our charts and not feel like we're only representing one side. So an example of that is the chart we've been making recently, showing deaths from COVID over the autumn months versus the spring months. And instead of simply presenting a chart like the one on the right-hand side showing deaths going up in the autumn, we've put the spring chart in there as well to demonstrate that although the numbers we've been seeing recently are not good, they're accelerating much more slowly than they were in the spring. So it's showing that, there are things to be concerned about, but it's not apocalyptic. This isn't a complete catastrophe. So that allows people, whether they are more pessimistic or optimistic, to have an entry point into this and feel that we're speaking to them. And finally, the best data journalism often means, and this is as true as ever in a pandemic, not just working with the data that governments and other organizations are putting out there, but actually going away, digging around and finding better data than that to answer the real questions. So an example of when we needed to do this was quite early on in the pandemic, when we had data showing that in Ecuador in South America, the numbers of daily deaths being recorded there were relatively low at around just 18 or 19 deaths per day. But this was at a time when we had our own reporters at the FT on the ground in Ecuador, talking about pretty grim scenes of things like vultures circling in the cities with where there were sort of cardboard coffins laid out on the roads below it. And so those two things didn't match up. We had a number out of the Ecuadorian government of relatively low death tolls, while we had pictures of something rather more awful. And so what we did was we went away and dug up data from other sources within Ecuador that many of our readers in that region had been pointing us towards. And we were able to show that there had actually been thousands of deaths in Ecuador by this point. And instead of 17 or 18 deaths per day, the true number at that point was about 600 or 700 per day. We've since then built that out, and we're doing this for more than a dozen countries around the world and updating this as regularly as we can. So going away and demonstrating to the reader that we care about getting to the truth here and giving them the best possible information, I think has been something that we've really felt has cut through. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of what we've been doing, why we've been doing it, and the reasons that we believe it has been cutting through. So yeah, thanks again for giving me the opportunity to speak about this, and I look forward to hearing any questions that anyone has.
Thanks very much indeed, John. We'll have the audience questions after we've had the next two presentations, but just before we go on, can you just clarify one thing that what you were just talking about there? You said that in Ecuador, the information you were getting from official sources was of these very low deaths. So what kind of other sources were you using then in order to update the figures, and what other sources then were using were there other countries that you had to then go sort of behind the scenes in a sense to get different different data?
So that's been really interesting stuff. So in Ecuador, it was some doctors and coroners were actually going out and publishing their own data which eventually the government, to be fair to Ecuador, this was not deliberate. They weren't downplaying things, but their sort of recording system just couldn't keep up. And in the end, they actually then started publishing that additional data sort of from the ground themselves. But there were some other examples where, for example, in places like Turkey and where was the other one? In Indonesia, we were using data on things like the numbers of cremations or burials being carried out and how that compares to past years. And these were websites that had been up and running for years, just sort of providing some kind of municipal service, but no one had thought to use them as this sort of measure of increased death tolls. So it was really just opening ourselves up to chat to anyone around the world who was coming to us with these alternative sources, checking out the sort of robustness and reliability of those sources, and then incorporating them in as soon as we could.
And were you satisfied that you were in the different countries comparing like with like in terms of excess deaths?
Yeah, I mean that's obviously the reason we went with this approach, which for those who haven't been following it is you compare the total numbers of people dying in a certain place at a certain time, you compare that to the same period in previous years, and broadly speaking, it has seemed to have done a pretty good job. It's also picked up pretty interesting nuances. So in somewhere like South Africa, during the first few weeks of their lockdown in the spring, they actually saw fewer deaths than usual because that was reducing deaths from homicides or from road fatalities. So there's been lots of really interesting additional storylines coming out of that. But yeah, we've certainly felt that providing that data is one of the very few ways to get real sort of apples to apples comparison to different countries. And obviously what a lot of the questions that readers have is, how does their country compare to others? And so by putting this out there, we give them a sort of better yardstick to use for those comparisons.
Yeah, we're going to hear more about South Africa in just a minute. But just one other final question from me, but I'm sure the audience will have more, is, when you took this decision very early on to make all your coronavirus coverage free and freely available, was that a kind of complete no-brainer, and is that really sort of that's really been a sort of worthwhile endeavor, has it, in terms of sort of greater prominence and greater traffic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those things that everyone's really benefited from, because we had, obviously one of the things that was clear early on in this was that we were getting a far bigger and far more diverse set of people interested in our work than are usually interested in the work that the FT puts out. So it was very clear that if we didn't put this out from behind the paywall, people were getting extremely frustrated, and I think it would have allowed the stereotypes to perpetuate of the FT being this sort of elitist place that's off limits to normal people. So part of it was just about actually meeting that need, but the other thing is that it has also been very beneficial for us, because as I showed a couple of examples there, people have still subscribed even though they didn't have to. I think it's been a demonstration to people that we as an organization care about getting them the information they need, and we're not going to keep the paywall up just because we can. So I think it's really just done a lot of work in terms of demonstrating to people, first of all, the range of stuff the FT covers, and secondly, that we do care about actually serving our audience and the audience we don't even have yet, in terms of getting the information to them that they want.
Yeah, no, and it's also sort of very interesting lessons for others about paywalls and what you can and can't do. Okay, we're going to move on now to South Africa, and Alet Law is speaking from Cape Town. She's the newsletter and engagement editor at News24, and she's a former opinions editor there. And she's going to talk from a very different perspective from what we've just heard from John, and she's going to look at sort of about telling the human stories and the human cost of the pandemic. So I'm going to hand over now to Alet. Welcome, and look forward to hearing from you now. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Suzanne. Let me quickly share my screen and we can get started. Yes, so good afternoon. I'm actually in Johannesburg today, in a very sunny Johannesburg. And yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. As Suzanne said, I am the newsletter and engagement editor at News24. We're South Africa's biggest digital news publication with roughly 7 million monthly users. We are online only. We have no legacy print edition, which makes life very much less complicated in these days. Our footprint is by far the biggest in South Africa, with about 72% of South Africans coming to us weekly, and 90% of those users finding us on their mobile devices, whether it is on our mobile sites or on our app. So we see ourselves very much as a mobile publisher. For the last 2 years, the Reuters Institute has found that we are South Africa's most trusted news brand, with 85% of South Africans saying that they believe that the news that we provide is credible and trustworthy. So naturally, when COVID-19 came to our shores, a lot of people turned to us for information on how on the impact of the virus and how it would eventually affect them. I think you would agree that COVID-19 has very much been a story of numbers, as John has also just so nicely illustrated to us. Yeah, so there was so much numbers to the story that we initially almost felt overwhelmed by it. And perhaps that is the story of a pandemic in many ways. It's the size of the outbreak that makes it a crisis. And that naturally becomes a news angle in many ways. So, you know, it is inevitably a numbers story, number of deaths, number of hospital beds available, time till a vaccine can be found, economic costs, you know, it's numbers. And because the story is so huge, these numbers take up a lot of resources and real estate to report, you know, as it rightly should. But at the heart of it, COVID-19, like any pandemic or disaster, really is a human story. And it's also human stories that people want to read long after the audience grows tired of the stats and the burgeoning numbers. And we realized this quite early on, and with that we were sorely lacking in our reporting of the human element of the virus. When South Africa's first known COVID-19 victim passed away, obviously the story was huge, and everyone ran with it. The victim was an average middle-class woman who hadn't been traveling and whose family couldn't think of a way or any way that she could have contracted the disease, have been exposed. So it really did shock the country in a sense, even though we were all waiting for it. But even more so because of that sense that could have been any one of us. But then the next few victims turned out to be healthcare professionals, on which the news reported. And then after that, it became less and less the human stories, the stories of the victims. And there were a number of reasons for this. But you would think, you know, that in a pandemic where hundreds and thousands of people were dying, that it would be easy to find people, family members of victims to speak to. But we found it to be the exact opposite. Despite our best efforts to find information about victims and to tell those stories, this information was very hard to come by. The government had published, or still publishes, the daily number of deaths and cases and recoveries every day. Our journalists reported on that. But further than that, they were very much restricted also, as was everyone, by the lockdown and the pandemic. We didn't want to expose them, you know, to the virus, even though they did go, you know, they tried their best to, or we did cover the pandemic as best we could, but there were definitely limits on what our journalists can do. In addition to that, many of the victims lived in places in far off, remote, rural areas, you know, where we don't necessarily have journalists or a footprint, and those areas were even harder to reach during this time. And we found it very hard to get in touch with people. And even as we found people, we found that they that there were additional challenges in that people weren't necessarily willing to, fear of stigmatization, fear of what people might say when they found out that someone had died of someone they knew or close to them had died of COVID-19. So that further complicated matters. But we wanted to place people at the center of the COVID-19 story because we realized that this really was the heart of the story. So we needed to make a plan. So we erected a remembrance wall, and we asked our readers to send us short obituaries or messages or tributes to loved ones that they had lost. We needed a few people on our wall to start with, so that our readers could see that what in essence our intention was with this wall. We were trading on our trust with our readers and our audience, and we wanted to make sure that they understood that this wasn't some sensationalist trick to get page views or you know, to play on other people's loss and tragedy, but that it really was something that we wanted to do to place people at the center of the story and to honor those people who had lost their lives to the victim, to the virus. So we assigned a few journalists to focus only on finding victim families, and it took us a number of weeks to get together 30 or so of these people, and we launched our wall with these 30 victim stories. And it really was a profound moment for our news coverage of the pandemic in South Africa. Not only for the coverage, but also for the newsroom, because I think it, in a way, really brought us back to our core purpose as journalists, which is telling people stories. And so with the site up, we put out a call to action to ask people to send us obituaries for their loved ones. We asked for names, ages, hometowns, and pictures with a short message or the basic information. And then we obviously also spread this message on all our platforms, on apps, social media, in our newsletters, etc. And the public response was overwhelmingly positive. I think that in a pandemic and in a national lockdown, such as the one we were in, there's a heightened sense of national community and that feeling of we're all in this together. And that shouldn't be overlooked when you are looking for ways to access information that is not available through normal means and channels. We received many messages from people thanking us for creating the platform and for creating a place for them to honor people they had lost. And we received moving tributes to people who had died. And we kept adding to this wall, and we now have more than 100 people, hundreds of people on there. And where there's an extraordinary story, we follow up with a new story, as we now obviously have the contact details. And then I just also want to mention that in addition to the victim stories, we realized that the lockdown story was just as big as the pandemic, and the two really walked hand in hand, and that you couldn't tell the one without the other. We did our multimedia team did a series on the faces of lockdown, where they went out and spoke to people whose lives were affected by the lockdown in different ways. They spoke to health workers, they spoke to drug addicts who didn't have access to drugs anymore. They spoke to a Sangoma who lost all his clients because they couldn't come to him, and he was distraught about how they were doing. So we saw that there was, you know, for many people, the lockdown had been an inconvenience, but for millions of people, it also destroyed their livelihoods. And in South Africa, there was great desperation, despite government's best efforts to help people. But with this, we saw an unbelievable upswell of charity and goodwill among people to help those in need. And every year for Mandela Day on the 18th of July, we tackle a project where we include our readers. And so this year we decided to put out a call to action again for people to nominate what we called everyday heroes, people who had gone above and beyond to help others during the lockdown in whichever big way or small they could. We asked people for pictures again and the basic information, and it really was heartwarming to see the nominations come in of people who held bake sales, who did marathons in their backyards, or who reinvented their businesses to deliver food packages and parcels to people in need in their communities. We identified 50 people and wrote a short story about each and featured them on a special mini site on our site. So the lessons from these two projects is that the human stories are there, and they are the best way to tell the story of the pandemic, because that is the stories that are most impactful and that people remember. The payoff for finding these stories is massive in many ways. It allows you to build relationships with your audience in a time that many of them are suffering. The benefit of these relationships goes both ways. People feel that they are seen and heard by something bigger than them, and in return for that, you build brand loyalty. As I said, human stories are a much more impactful way to bring across the effects of the virus, which means, yeah, it's a much more visceral way to communicate that message, also in motivating people to adhere to lockdown restrictions. And then lastly, crowdsourcing is a great way to get information when your normal channels of getting to that information is cut off. It's not lazy journalism, you still need to verify the facts and write the stories and follow up and make sure you get everything right. It is just an entry point to the information and a tool made available to us by our own hard work in creating, our platforms. And the loyalty from our audiences. So I would highly recommend using that. I think we've used it twice here to great success. And I think the loyalty that we've generated or created from this among our audience is going to pay back in spades still in the future. And yeah, that's my story. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alet. That's a fascinating and really, really powerful example of how you can sort of reach out. I mean, what has been the feedback now from what you've done? How what's been the response to that? Have you had lots and lots of good
I think
feedback from?
It's been overwhelmingly positive. As I said, I think we were wary that we didn't want to look like we were exploiting people's personal tragedies, but I think those people who did embrace it by sending in their loved ones' stories were so appreciative of the fact that, as I said, that they were given this platform and that this tragedy, this thing that happened to them didn't happen in isolation, but that they could share this with other people, to share their grief, and also in a way that could maybe help someone else who felt, that they were alone with this tragedy that struck. We got many emails from people who were just simply, so grateful for the platform. And of course, you always get your critics, they are everywhere, and we expect them, and we respond to those and explain our thinking. But it's been an overwhelmingly positive experience for us.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to move on now quickly, and then come back to the questions audience at the end, because we want to go now to somewhere very, very different. We're going to Hong Kong to hear a different perspective, and from Josephine Ma, who's the news editor of the China Bureau of the South China Morning Post. So she's based in Hong Kong, but she's reporting out of China. So Josephine is going to talk about what, in a sense, it was like to be on the very front line of reporting the crisis. Because if you think about it, in South Africa or the UK or other places, we had at least some point time to get our heads around what was happening, because this was all playing out in China in advance. But when the story broke in China, I mean, nobody knew what the sort of huge global ramifications were that were about to hit them. So it was really kind of absolutely sort of breaking new story. Although there had been echoes of it in the past, I suppose. Josephine, would you like to start now, and then do everybody think about questions, because when Josephine's finished, I'll take questions then for all of our panelists.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a privilege to speak alongside with all these distinguished journalists. Let me share my screen first. Share my PowerPoint first. All right. So, my name is Josephine Ma, and I'm an editor with the China desk of the South China Post. We have a very large team covering China.
Sorry, Josephine, you have not shared your screen yet.
Oh, I haven't?
Yes.
Sorry. Let me do it again.
So you saw the green button, share screen at the bottom?
Yeah. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Yes,
that's
correct.
right.
So you press to present. Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry for the hiccup. All right. So yeah, we have a very large team covering China. Actually, it's our expertise in covering China. And we have bureaus in different parts, in different cities in China. So, and I myself have covered like a lot of like different outbreaks in China. For example, I was there in Beijing covering SARS 17 years ago, running around between hospitals. I covered the AIDS outbreak in Henan, and I covered the bird flu outbreak in China before as well. Even though I don't just cover medical stories, I cover other stories as well. So I would like to share with you about how we cover the coronavirus epidemic at the beginning, at the early stage, and some of the investigative work we have done. Just like what Professor Franks just said, there was so little knowledge about this mysterious pneumonia at the time, and how do we find out information about this mysterious disease, and how do we do our best to fill the information gap. So, so this is the first story on this coronavirus outbreak. It was on December 31st. At the time, not many people paid attention to it, and we were one of the first media covering it. And it's also to do with our experience in SARS. We are like on high alert when something like this happened. So at that time, the Hong Kong government, they actually had a emergency meeting on it as well, even though there was no evidence at the time, like how transmissible the disease is and what kind of virus that was. And then since like early January, we have been sending reporters to Wuhan, and we were one of the first media outside mainland China to send reporters to Wuhan. And we send like different people intermittently. And at first it was pretty calm in the city, and you can't find like a lot of like evidence about how the disease has been spreading among people at the time. And then we started to have like more information. And for example, on January the 23rd, our reporters were there like in different hospitals, and she witnessed how the medical system broke down. And but people were not were not very, I mean, they weren't, I mean, things were so bad. I mean, the corridors were like packed with people, packed with patients, and there was not enough PPEs, and patients told us that they have to take a taxi to different hospitals trying to get the diagnosis confirmed and trying to get treatment, and they were so worried that they would pass the disease to taxi drivers. And also we have, like, for example, this video interview with a family talking about how difficult it is to get his father tested. So we have so at the beginning of the outbreak, I mean, the thing we did is to send reporters on the front line and try to find out what actually happened. And was the disease transmissible between humans? Could the medical system cope? And how was the disease like SARS? And so there were lots of questions, and what we could do is to send people there to get the first-hand information. And luckily, we had experience in covering SARS. I remember like telling my frontline colleague about how to protect herself in the hospital because I covered SARS before, and I told her how to disinfect herself. So this kind of experience did help. So even after the lockdown, let me mention the lockdown, because the government locked down the city on January 23rd, and our reporter had to run away from the city before the lockdown. And it was a very critical time, because that was right before what we call the Chinese New Year, when people travel home, and it was the largest internal migration of the world, when you have like billions of people moving in the country. So it was like really hectic time, and critical time about like whether the government can successfully stop the spread of the virus to other parts of the country. So even after the lockdown, we continue to call people on the ground, and we have like this exclusive report about how this eyewitness, she was a nurse, and how she witnessed like corpses lying in the corridor of a hospital, because the medical staff were too occupied. There were too many patients, and they were overwhelmed, and they didn't have time to take care of the dead bodies. So like horrific account. And so these are the frontline eyewitness stories we did at the time. So, and then we move on. So with the eyewitness accounts, there are also lots of information gap to fill. And one question we asked ourselves at the time was, there were official reports saying that there were cases in Wuhan, but there was no evidence that it could transmit between humans. But we started hearing like cases of people traveling out from China to overseas, and they were confirmed. They were tested positive. There was a case in Thailand. And so we were joking in the newsroom at the time. I mean, how come there were no cases outside Wuhan, and there were only cases outside like China? And we started like looking into that aspect, and of course we use our expertise in China reporting, and we finally confirmed that there were actually cases in Shenzhen and Shanghai, and there was no official report at the time. And I remember that story was published on a Saturday. It was quite a stressful weekend because on Sunday the government denied the report, but and then on Monday, various local government started reporting cases in their localities. So our report was confirmed on the third day. This is another investigative story we have done in another exclusive story we have broke at the time. So we got information, I mean, including our reporters on the front line telling us like how overwhelmed the medical system was, and there was not enough PPE, and people were in panic at the time. It's to do with the mysterious nature of the virus, and also the shortage of all these PPEs, protective kits at the time. And we heard that there were lots of medical staff infected, but there was no like aggregated number. We kept track on all these scientific paper very closely, and I think it's worth pointing out that different from SARS, the Chinese scientists are actually very prolific in publishing scientific papers, even since the early stage of the pandemic. And so we kept track, and we saw, like we read one paper saying, there was a cluster of 40 medical staff being infected in one hospital, but we didn't know the full picture. And that was a question that scientists were asking at the time, because the number of infections among medical staff actually is an indicator of how transmissible the virus is, and also whether the medical system could cope with the outbreak. And I remember like reading one tweet from one of the scientists from Johns Hopkins asking that question. And at that time, I was also chasing that story, and I was thinking, oh, I should get that number. I mean, I should try my best to get the number, because that's an important information gap. And with a lot of work, we broke this story that at least 500 Wuhan medical staff were infected. These were confirmed cases. And in the story, we actually mentioned there were another 600 suspected cases. But we want to be very precise with our headlines, so we said at least 500 Wuhan medical staff infected. So a few days later, the government confirmed. So there were more than 1,500 medical staff, 1,700 healthcare workers infected with the coronavirus. So that was one of the breaking stories, one of the exclusive stories from our investigations. So this is another example of an exclusive story from our investigation. So the Chinese definition of a confirmed case is quite different from the rest of the world. Since February, the Chinese government revised the definition of confirmed case. They didn't count asymptomatic cases in the statistic for confirmed cases. And so that means if there is a positive case, and if the patient or if the person doesn't show symptom, that isn't count as a confirmed case. And the thing is, there was so little information about how transmissible a silent carrier is, and we didn't know the size. I mean, how prevalent they are. And at that time, the WHO was saying, asymptomatic transmission was not the main source of transmission, and the number shouldn't be very high. But we also read from some scientists' paper using models, saying that the spread of the disease must have to do with silent carriers. And but we don't know the exact size. So somehow we got this exclusive information from the government data. So 1/3 of the silent carriers, 1/3 of the confirmed cases by the end of February were actually either pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic. And we have to think about how to give the right context to this story. It's a very tricky one. Number one, it's very tricky in finding the right context or the right case for comparison. In the US, for example, they didn't test people with no symptom at that time. So even if we use the US data, I mean, it's not comparable. It's not the right context. And at that time, we decided the best way to compare the data is to compare the data in Korea, and also in Korea, because they have this high number of tests. They have this pass-through test, and a lot of people did tests, and they have and they kept track of all these close contacts. So and they test like whether you have symptoms or not. So Korea is a good case for comparison. And another case, I mean, there weren't many statistics about asymptomatic at the time. So another case is the infection in a cruise. It's called Princess Diamond. It's a cruise from Japan, but it docked in Hong Kong for a while. So Japan actually tested everybody on board, and they have a breakdown on the symptomatic cases and asymptomatic cases. So we use these research and also these number, and also including the research from other scientists to give context to our readers about, and we find that all these figures are highly compatible. So 1/3 is about the size. I mean, in Korea, it was about 20%. But at that time, I mean, some people, I mean, were saying, oh, maybe asymptomatic patients are they just take up a very small amount of like 1 to 3%. There were some talks like that at the time, but we want to find out the true picture. And of course, we interviewed a lot of scientists to give background, to tell readers why this number is important to them. So that's our exclusive story. And at the time, there was also a lot of worries. There were a lot of worries among Wuhan residents, because they saw posters saying, oh, we have a positive case here. But when they read the government statistic, there was no such, I mean, there was no such case, because that case was asymptomatic and that was not included in the government statistic. So because of the pressure from the people, and also I think because of all these revelations and all these statistics coming out from different countries, and also our reports, the government started reporting asymptomatic cases from March 31st. But they didn't release the aggregate number of asymptomatic case. They only released the number of asymptomatic case of that day. So if that person turned negative, or if that person become symptomatic, then that was not included in the count. But still, I mean, that was very important that the number of asymptomatic cases China got every day was released, I mean, was publicized from the end of March. So I also want to mention these two very interesting projects by our colleagues. I think they are like really an example about how we can integrate different kinds of information and using formats that readers, readers find interesting to present something, to present multiple dimensions of a very complicated human crisis. So this is a multimedia project by my colleague, and it was published on February 27th. And at the time, we were still like in the discovery stage of like finding out what this epidemic was, and also what actually happened in China. So we use coherence, we use different formats. We combine information we got from the ground. So we actually combine the witness account from all these reporters we sent to the front line. And we combine information we got from mainland Chinese media. Actually, there were some very good reports there as well. And we combined background, I mean, scientific background that readers should know. I mean, including what is a virus, and what how virus was discovered, and also the WHO prediction of disease X in 2018. And so we combine everything: scientific background, witness account, and also reports from China, and also comments from scientists talking about like what are the significances of these and what are we seeing now. And we combine all these plus infographic. We have a very nice infographic of the timeline, and we weave everything into a coherent narrative with nice visual. And yeah, this explainer got a lot of clicks, and personally I like it very much. I think it's a brilliant project. And it's in September we did something similar. There were a lot of like speculations and talks about all these lab leakage theory and so on, and we look at the biosafety issue of labs around the world, and also the history of it, and also what kind of viruses these labs were handling. And also we got scientists' comments about like why lab safety is an important issue we should look at. So it's also a comprehensive project looking at weaving in like all this information into a coherent narrative together with nice infographic. And so these two projects both receive very good feedback from readers. So so now I'll give a little summary of what we have learned in this process, in this journey. I only highlighted like some of the stories we did in the early days. So collaboration is very important. I heard from some of the panelists earlier that we shouldn't work in silos, and I totally agree with that. We actually different teams, and also colleagues working in different bureaus, and people who like who cover science, people who cover social stories, political stories, and all sorts of like people work together, people who have specialty in covering stories in Asia, in other countries, and in different, who can speak different languages to help us digging out information from different countries. So this is to have good storytelling. I mean, it's so important to have collaboration from people of different expertise and specialty. And I will also want to highlight how important it is to research for stories. I personally read like scientific journals. So, I mean, I read so many scientific journals. I mean, for example, when we were researching on the asymptomatic stories, we have to go through all these definition of like how you diagnose this, how you define a confirmed case, and what is being tested positive, what is pre-symptomatic, and what is the incubation period, and all this. And with a lot of research, and we can provide like the right context to readers. And tapping in experience and expertise, I do think like our experience in covering SARS help. It bring back a lot of memories when we covered SARS. And also we are, I mean, South China Morning Post, I mean, we have been an important China watcher for decades, and we have a large team, and this kind of experience in reporting on China helps a lot when we cover the story in the early stage. And putting public interest first, I really think that because we are so, I mean, media is so influential, and there are so many like speculations and fake reports and misinformation floating around, and building our credibility and to have the discernment of what is factual, what is objective, and discern them, to have the discernment to distinguish fake news, speculations, and facts is so important. So that's my presentation, and yeah, I hope it helps, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josephine. Do you want to stop sharing your screen? Maybe
okay.
Yeah. So just time for a few questions, because we're running a bit over, and in Singapore I know it's getting late. So John, couple of questions for you about your team. So people want to know how many are in the team now, in your data team now, and how many did you have at the beginning of the year? So obviously, has it changed since January and now? And then also, what are the particular skills that people have in their data visualization team?
Cool. Yeah, great questions. The numbers haven't really changed over time. We've actually, unfortunately, had a couple of people move on to new things, but I think that's more sort of pandemic induced than a result of our workloads. So it's one of those unhelpful answers in terms of it really depends how you slice and dice it. So I'd say we probably have about 3 or 4 of us who see ourselves as data journalists, so producing actual, like getting the stories out there, finding out the information, getting bylines. We then have 3 or 4 web developers who are helping us make these interactive charts and that kind of thing. And then another dozen or so visual journalists who are working on individual charts, but generally they've been more involved in the sort of non-COVID stuff. So I'd say about 7 or 8 of us probably who've been working on the COVID stuff over the last 8 months, maybe more like 10. And in terms of skill sets, so that varies. All of us are obviously comfortable working with data sets and working with some level of graphics, but again, I'd say there are some specialisms. So half a dozen of us who work with programming languages like Python or R and JavaScript in order to manipulate all the data we've been working with, because the data that we use for these charts is often like hundreds of thousands of rows and that kind of thing. And then similarly on the graphics side, some of us who predominantly use sort of plug and play tools, as it were, but then another 7 or 8 of us who can sort of start with a blank canvas, as it were, and put something together from scratch.
Right. And has that been that people have sort of picked that up since they've been with you in the FT? I mean, have you sort of trained a lot of these people and brought them on, or do they arrive fully formed?
It's a combination, really. So I mean, speaking for myself as well, like when I joined, which was about 7 years ago, I mainly used Excel for all my data work, and I would use existing software to make charts, whereas now I'm using programming languages to do all of that. And so a lot of it has been learned on the job. But yeah, I would say certainly over the last year, one thing we're focusing on is trying to get more people skilled up in using these coding languages for data analysis, because the huge benefit there is that when you're using something like spreadsheets, it's quite difficult to collaborate because each person has their own spreadsheet, and you can't really sort of all be working on the same file at once, where in the same way you can with, for example, a Google Doc. And the other thing is, if you're doing the same task every day, which is often what we're doing, we're sort of loading in some data, COVID data from one place, then doing a load of manipulation and analysis of that data to produce something at the end. The advantage of coding is that you have one script which anyone on the team can run, and it will produce exactly the same results. And if you're going to do it every day, then you just run that script every day instead of fiddling about with the spreadsheet and remembering what you did every day. So getting people to move from spreadsheets to programming languages has been a big thing we've been focusing on over the last year. And so we do a lot of internal tutorials on that kind of thing.
Interesting, right? That's also interesting for us at City to hear that too. So a very different question now. Maybe Alet, if you want to take this one. This is from Ung Pang Shen in Singapore, who wants to know particularly about media literacy. What ideas you have for media literacy for engaging audiences? You know, because you're doing a lot of work, sort of reaching out to to your audiences. What sort of thoughts do you have about, I mean, this is a huge question, goes way beyond just this pandemic, but how can we ensure that audiences become more media literate and, you know, in a sense, I suppose, from teaching children to become media literate, to engage?
That is a hard question. Thank you for that.
I'm sure you thought about it. This must
no,
be
definitely. Last night before bed, I thought about this. No, I think that's such a big and important question, and I think it's something that everyone should be thinking about. And you know, how you tackle it, I think very much depends on your context. I can only speak for South Africa, and I think you know, in a country where even literacy is an obstacle, media literacy can be even more so. For us at News24, it's really about, you know, being explicit about what we are about as a news organization, and what our philosophy is, and what our about facts and the truth, and why it is important that, you know, that we do what we do, and that we are able to do what we do, and that we receive support for what we do. You know, and then it's just about communicating that as far and wide as you can. As far as what we can do for our children go, you know, I think our schools have such a big role to play in this. I mean, and you know how big a role a teacher plays in every child's life. But I think it's about exposing children from a young age to certain parts of what the media can contribute to your life and your education. I mean, surely we are very much aware of the fact that not everything we publish on News24 is suited for young audiences, and we're always, you know, very aware of that. But there's so much educational content on News24 and our sister publications, our vertical publications, and I think there's so much that can be done with that if there's the will. But yeah, I think it's a massive obstacle. I don't have the answer for you, actually, Suzanne. I think that's something that, you know, every country, you know, is unique in that sense, and has its unique obstacles. And I can only commiserate in that it is a big problem for us as well.
What about you, Josephine? Have you got anything to add to that from Hong Kong, or even from China, that obviously you know a lot about, in terms of, because you talked about, you know, protecting us audiences against fake news and so on. I mean, what can we do in terms of media literacy and educating against media?
One thing we can do is to try to use simple words, because when we read a lot of scientific paper, we tend to use scientific jargons. But what media can do for the public is to try to simplify things, and it's almost like a distillation process. You distill what is the gist of the thing, and then you relay it in everyday language. And I think that's something important, and that's something we can do as media to help improve the literacy, I mean the science literacy of people. Because for example, recent days I write a lot on vaccines, and people always like my other colleagues would say, I mean, I don't understand this word, and can you change it to some layman word? I mean, layman language. And I think as media, we have the responsibility to do that, to kind of like translate very like boring and complicated scientific stuff into something people can read, and even like children, I mean, or school students can understand. So, and I also think explainers are very important, like including visual explainers, video explainers, and also explainers in text, in words. They're very important. Asking simple questions and put out these like easy to read explainers to readers. That's what we can contribute.
Yes, I mean, it was interesting, John, that you were talking about putting explainers with the data that, you know, when you were, that the raw data wasn't enough, that you needed text, you needed to explain, and you needed to make it much more accessible.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, I mean, what we found was that I think one of the things that readers really appreciated with our work was that the fact that we were doing this as a conversation. We weren't just sort of putting out some charts and walking away and saying, leave it to you. I mentioned that we set up this additional email account, and every day when we posted these charts on social media, we'd say, if you have any questions or suggestions, do let us know here. And I think that's one of the things that really cut through. Again, going back to Shirish's talk at the start, we were demonstrating that we were doing this as a service, and that our goal was to put out whatever information readers wanted. And therefore, if they wanted extra or different things, they should tell us. And I think it was that gesture, as well as obviously what we actually did in terms of following through on it, that people really appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, all three of you have shown a fantastic service. I mean, if you think about from the numbers and the human stories and the investigations that we've heard about today, you know, you've all done brilliant work. I'm being told that we've run over rather now, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there. But thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you to the audience, but thank you to all of you in Hong Kong and Cape Town and London for contributing, and it's been really, really interesting. So I'll hand back now to Sherilyn, to WAN-IFRA.
Good. What a wonderful hour and a half. Thank you, everybody. Real insights into what you're doing in your newsrooms. Just on the last question of media literacy, for those of you who know Alan Rusbridger, who's the former editor of The Guardian, he's just brought out a book that's probably worth reading if you're interested in the future of journalism, where he addresses the issue of youth or trust in media and how we get out of the predicament we're in. And he says quite clearly that civic education at schools needs to be introduced. And that ties in with a lot of what people have found with the fake news story, is that children get it much more than middle-aged adults. And if you teach the children correctly, then hopefully that'll filter up and start to reform attitudes and the way people consume news. So that's it from us for today. Again, thank you to Temasek Foundation for their funding that's made this possible. Good, we'll see you tomorrow.